Sonia Sotomayor just made the biggest mistake of her judicial career. She smirked at Karoline Leavitt's argument right in the Supreme Court. A grave error. Leavitt fired back. You laugh, but you just laughed at the very voice of the American people. What happens next will shake Sotomayor's career forever. Hit the like button because you're about to witness the most brutal legal takedown in history. A bold young face is about to unleash top-secret evidence that will stun you. Sonia Sotomayor thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. The Supreme Court courtroom was so silent, you could hear the faint tap of a pen on the stone table, until a smirk broke from the highest bench, where Sonia Sotomayor leaned back with a hint of arrogance. The sound echoed through the marble space, as if deliberately challenging every ear listening. And in that moment, the packed room of reporters, lawyers, and observers all looked up, their eyes fixed on Karoline Leavitt, the young White House spokesperson standing below the dark wooden podium. Her eyes flashed with a cold glint, her lips pressed tight but steady, and with a firm voice, she cut through the arrogance with a question that rang like a blade. Justice Sotomayor, do you find the Constitution of the United States a joke? The air froze, the pens stopped tapping, cameras zoomed in on every face, and even the justices flanking Sotomayor shifted slightly, for no one had ever dared to hurl such a raw, direct question at a Supreme Court justice, especially not from a woman in her late 20s, with no experience in Congress or wielding a gavel, now facing one of the most powerful voices in the American legal system. The silence stretched like an invisible verdict, but that silence became Leavitt's weapon, for she knew that in front of the public, no shouting was needed, just calm, and the right question could expose the recklessness of her opponent. Sotomayor raised an eyebrow, her gaze still lofty, but her hand on the case file tightened, the pen trembling slightly, a small sign that didn't escape the watchful eyes, and Leavitt knew the spark for the battle had been ignited. This wasn't just any case. It was a debate about the limits of free speech in an era where the government was accused of meddling too deeply in the digital space, choosing which voices could exist and which had to be buried under the guise of information safety. Leavitt, sent to represent the administration, chose to confront the most veteran liberal justice head-on. The contrast was stark on the bench. Sotomayor in her black robe, a symbol of unyielding tradition and authority. Below Leavitt, in an emerald green suit, a symbol of youth and defiance. A small but sharp arrow aimed at the seemingly impregnable wall of the establishment. Sotomayor leaned back in her high-backed chair, hands clasped, her calm but icy gaze sweeping downward, as if to assert her untouchable position, then spoke in a firm, weighty tone. Freedom must have limits. The room seemed to pause at the statement, which rang not just as a legal argument, but as a command, a preset principle from someone at the pinnacle. But Karoline Leavitt didn't let the silence linger. She leaned forward, pulled out a thick file filled with cold, hard numbers, and spoke sharply. Then look at this, Justice. In the past 18 months, millions of political statements by American citizens have been erased from online platforms, and I have evidence showing it wasn't the tech companies acting alone, but under covert government directives. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras panned to the press gallery, where reporters hunched over keyboards, typing furiously, capturing every detail, as if afraid to miss a rare moment when a young woman dared to directly challenge a Supreme Court justice. Leavitt took half a step forward, head held high, eyes locked on Sotomayor, her voice steady and resonant, each word striking the marble walls. You laugh, but the people aren't laughing when their voices are silenced for dissenting views. She raised a colorful chart, its data bars rising like accusations, posts about immigration deleted, articles on education policy blocked, thousands of accounts suspended for challenging mainstream views. A veteran who sacrificed his youth on the battlefield was stripped of his voice for questioning border policies. A single mother had her post calling for transparency in her child's curriculum wiped clean. These aren't enemies of the state. They're American citizens exercising their most fundamental constitutional right to express their views. Leavitt's voice rang out, steady. No need for theatrics. The restraint made its weight all the heavier. Sotomayor raised an eyebrow, her gaze still superior, but her clasped hands began tapping lightly on the table, a small sign of unease. She responded calmly. The public square must be protected from misinformation. We cannot let chaos masquerade as freedom. But Leavitt didn't hesitate, her voice sharp and forceful. Who defines truth, Justice? Who gets to say what's misinformation and what's correct? When the government grants itself the power to define truth, That's no longer democracy. It's tyranny dressed up in legal terms. A few murmurs rose. Reporters looked up. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Leavitt turned the file, pulling out another report stamped by an independent agency, holding it high. Here's the second piece of evidence. What's happened isn't random. It's a deliberate, systematic pattern. And this administration has meddled so deeply that ordinary people can't tell their own voices from the curated ones. The air grew taut. The back rows stirred faintly, as if the entire room was witnessing an entrenched power openly challenged. Sotomayor started to speak again, but Leavitt's resolute eyes stopped her words in her throat. In that moment, everyone sensed it. The balance of power in the marble chamber had shifted, and for the first time, a justice's dismissive smile had been turned into an accusation against her. Leavitt didn't stop at dry numbers or reports. She slowly signaled her technical assistant, and instantly, a large screen behind her lit up, replaying a 10-year-old video. The room glowed with pale blue light as Sotomayor's 2012 image appeared, her unmistakable voice ringing out. Free speech is the backbone of democracy. The sound echoed, as if from another era, now placed in the very room where its speaker sat arrogantly on the bench. Leavitt turned to the screen, then back to Sotomayor, her gaze icy, her voice steady. You believed it once. You told the public that without free speech, democracy is an empty shell. So today, when you laugh at it, are you laughing at the silenced citizens, at the very backbone you called it? A wave of murmurs rose from the audience. Reporters raised cameras in unison, snapping furiously to capture the rare moment when a Supreme Court justice was bound by her own words. Sotomayor furrowed her brow, leaning back slightly, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. The context was different. Today is about safety, about protecting society from lies that can cause chaos. She paused, as if hoping her words would quell the rising tide. But Leavitt seized the moment, stepping forward, pointing to the screen frozen on Sotomayor's stern face from the old video. Different context, you say, but what democracy isn't tested by chaos? What freedom comes without responsibility? You once told the American people the Constitution protects them, no matter the time or situation. And now, when the government wants to curate voices, you invoke safety to mask censorship. So which is the real Sotomayor? The one from 2012 or the one today? The room fell silent, not a sound but the hum of cameras and the scratch of pens. A piercing blow had been struck, and all could see. Leavitt had turned Sotomayor's own words into a sword, aimed straight at her. Sotomayor closed her eyes for a second, her hand gripping the pen tightly, then opened them, responding slowly. The world has changed. The threats today are different from 10 years ago. A justice must consider new realities. But Leavitt was ready, her voice clear and sharp. No, ma'am, a justice doesn't get to redefine the foundation of democracy because of fleeting fears. If free speech is the backbone, you just laughed at the skeleton of this republic. And when the backbone breaks, the entire body of democracy collapses. Eyes from the gallery, fixed on Sotomayor, no longer with absolute reverence, but with scrutiny and doubt. In that moment, everyone felt it. The familiar order in the marble chamber had been upended, and the debate was no longer a one-sided lecture, but a battle where a smirk had been turned into a self-inflicted wound. Leavitt didn't let the silence swallow the atmosphere after her strike. She signaled her assistant, and immediately, a file with a red cover marked confidential was brought forward. She placed it on the wooden podium, opening it before hundreds of eyes, pulling out pages filled with text, highlighted in bold yellow. This, she said, her voice lowering but resonating in the marble space, is a chain of leaked emails from federal agencies, sent directly to the nation's largest tech companies. In these emails, there are lists of hundreds of political posts, thousands of individual accounts, with clear instructions. Priority: suppress political misinformation. She paused, letting the room absorb the bold text now displayed on the large screen behind her, each word glowing starkly against the dark background, like a wound carved into the air. A murmur rose. Many leaned forward to read the projected text. Cameras zoomed in on each word, reporters typing so fast the sound was almost frantic. Sotomayor frowned, her lips a tight line, then spoke, her voice dry and restrained. This is not lawful evidence. These documents haven't been authenticated through proper channels, and this court cannot accept them. But Leavitt didn't back down, lifting the paper high, her eyes blazing with resolve. Lawful or not, it's still the truth. And you, ma'am, just laughed at it. Millions of citizens have been silenced by lists like these, and you're telling me that doesn't matter, just because it lacks an official seal. A faint bang on a table came from a far corner, unclear if it was anger or agreement, but enough to show the room was heating up. Leavitt took another half step, her voice cutting like a blade. The American people don't care about legalistic wordplay. They see their voices erased. They see accounts suspended, posts vanished. And now, when I present evidence of covert coordination between the government and big tech, you choose to smirk. The final sentence landed heavily, and the contrast was clear. On one side, the leaked file with bold text like an undeniable scar. On the other, a Supreme Court justice trying to maintain her authoritative facade. Sotomayor leaned forward slightly, about to respond, but Leavitt's icy gaze held firm, trapping her words. The room buzzed, cameras flashed relentlessly, and the numbers, the orders to suppress political misinformation, hung on the screen like an indictment needing no jury. In that moment, though no one declared it officially, all felt the balance of power in the courtroom tip further toward the young woman who turned a leak into a weapon. Leavitt didn't stop at the emails that had already stirred the room. She knew this was the moment for a decisive blow, one undeniable, that would bind her opponent with her own words. She slowly flipped through the file on the podium, as if prolonging the suspense, then stopped at a thick set of papers stamped with the Supreme Court's seal from 2015. Her voice was steady, not loud, but firm. Justice Sotomayor, 10 years ago you wrote the majority opinion in People v. State Communications Board. Allow me to quote a passage. As she finished, the large screen behind her lit up, displaying the text in bold, highlighted lines. The government cannot choose which voices exist and which must vanish. Free speech is a foundational principle, above all political or state calculations. The words glowed on the dark background, unyielding as if etched in stone. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Some reporters gasped softly. Cameras flashed non-stop to capture the rare moment when a Supreme Court justice was held accountable by her own text before the public. Leavitt turned, no longer looking at the screen, but directly at Sotomayor, her eyes burning to pin the truth on her opponent. These are your words, not mine, not anyone else's. You told the nation that the government has no right to choose which voices can exist. So today, you sit here defending the silencing of voices, laughing at citizens being muted. So who are you? The Sotomayor of 2015, or the Sotomayor of today? The air thickened, as if the marble walls absorbed the tension. Sotomayor leaned back slightly, lips pursed, hand gripping the pen, but her voice came, lower than usual. The legal context then was different. That case involved the rights of a suppressed religious minority. Today, we face threats from misinformation that can undermine society's foundation. I haven't betrayed any principle. I'm applying them to new realities. Her response emphasized realities, but it couldn't stop the chill spreading through the room. Leavitt cut in, not letting the pause save her opponent. Different, then tell me, is a principle just fashion, changing with the season? A constitutional principle can't bend because of fleeting fears. You wrote that free speech is foundational, above all political calculations. So why today do you make it a tool for selection, distribution, labeling? If a minority deserved protection in 2015, why don't millions of Americans today? Leavitt's voice rang steady, each word like a hammer on the wooden table. Behind her, pens paused for seconds, absorbing the weight of the intellectual duel. On the bench, other justices' eyes turned to Sotomayor. No one spoke, but the silence was more damning than any rebuke. Justice Roberts tapped a finger lightly. Kagan tilted her head. Others stared at the screen, where Sotomayor's old ruling glowed, undeniable. Sotomayor tried to keep her voice calm, but a slight tremor emerged. The realities of a decade ago aren't today's. Information can be weaponized, spread rapidly, threaten national security. Our duty is to balance freedom and safety. She finished, lifting her chin, trying to regain control. But Leavitt was ready, with the final blow. She leaned in, voice low but sharp. Safety isn't an excuse to bend the Constitution. When you use weaponized informations to justify systematic silencing, you admit the government is becoming the arbiter of truth, and a government that picks truth soon can't distinguish truth from power. That's the betrayal. The statement shook the room. Many sat frozen, faces pensive, realizing this was no longer a technical legal debate, but a dissection of faith and justice. Sotomayor opened her mouth, but only a few words came before she stopped. Leavitt's cold gaze like a blade at her throat. Her colleagues didn't intervene, their silence speaking volumes. Leavitt sealed the moment with a final strike. The people don't need a court telling them freedom only matters when it's convenient. They need a court that upholds principles, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient. And you, Justice Sotomayor, wrote that. You can't run from your own words. A heavy silence fell. On the screen, the 2015 text glowed, unyielding. Sotomayor sat up, masking her unease, but all saw her hand tremble slightly. The legal trap Leavitt set had tightened, not with tricks but with her opponent's own words, turning consistency into chains, the past into a verdict on the present. In that moment, no one doubted. Power in the marble chamber had tilted further toward the young woman challenging tradition. The air in the courtroom grew thick after Leavitt's legal trap. On the screen, Sotomayor's 2015 ruling shone like an indelible scar, forcing all to face the contradiction. But Sotomayor, known for her tenacity in arguments, didn't yield easily. She took a deep breath, eyes dropping to her notes, then looked up, her voice ringing out, no longer soft but firm, even icy. Without control, truth will be distorted. In this era, misinformation can spread faster than a plague, and we, as guardians of the Constitution, have a duty to stop it before it destroys society. As her words fell, part of the audience nodded, but many reporters frantically typed, capturing the rare moment when a Supreme Court justice used the word control to justify justice. Leavitt didn't let it slide. She slightly bowed her head, her lips curling into a faint, sardonic smile. Then her voice rang out, sharp as a swung blade. Who gave you the right to define truth for the people? This Constitution wasn't written for a select few on a high bench to decide what's right or wrong. It was written so every citizen could seek, compare, and debate, even when they're wrong. It's the debate that shapes truth. And you, ma'am, just turned truth into a privilege, handed out at the court's whim like private property. A shockwave rippled through the room. Cameras zoomed in on Leavitt's face, her eyes blazing, her voice unwavering, growing ever more resolute. Sotomayor flinched at the directness, losing her usual composure for the first time. She sat up straight, her voice rising, no longer the calm tone of a Supreme Court justice, but laced with unconcealed irritation. You're too young to understand that freedom isn't absolute. Without limits, freedom becomes chaos, and chaos kills justice. We don't choose truth out of arrogance. We do it for national security. It was the first time in the hearing that Sotomayor raised her voice, and that volume, instead of overpowering, exposed her loss of control. Her words echoed, but didn't silence the room. Instead, they drew more scrutinizing eyes toward her. Leavitt seized the moment like a fighter spotting an opening. She didn't retreat, but stepped forward, hand on the podium, voice firm. Chaos doesn't come from freedom, justice. Chaos comes from abuse of power. When the government and courts grant themselves the right to decide which voices can be heard, that's the real chaos. Chaos of trust. When people no longer believe this system belongs to them. The room erupted in murmurs. A few reporters whispered, "She just said that to her face." Cameras panned quickly, catching every expression from the other justices. Some maintained neutrality, but their eyes betrayed surprise. Sotomayor slammed her pen on the table, the sharp sound echoing like an attempt to assert control. But Leavitt didn't flinch. The debate turned into a rapid-fire exchange, a relentless back and forth like sword strikes. Sotomayor, voice tight. "Don't you see? Those spreading lies have made thousands doubt our elections. Isn't that proof that free speech needs guardrails?" Leavitt firing back instantly. "No, it's proof the public's losing faith in the system, because they're being dismissed. When voices are silenced, they'll turn elsewhere to listen and believe. Censorship doesn't heal wounds. It only buries the infection deeper." Each of Leavitt's words landed like a stone dropped into a still lake, sending ripples outward. Sotomayor tried to regain control, her voice growing sharper. "If we let freedom run rampant, we'll see society collapse under the weight of lies and hate. This court has a duty to prevent that." But Leavitt countered immediately, without hesitation. "The court's duty isn't to police thought. Its duty is to protect constitutional rights, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable. Democracy is never easy, but it's our choice. And democracy doesn't exist if you smirk while citizens are silenced." The room's atmosphere had utterly shifted. Those in the back rows leaned forward, listening as if mesmerized. Cameras flashed incessantly. Reporters typed so furiously it sounded like rain on the wooden tables. Sotomayor tilted her head, about to interject, but Leavitt didn't let her catch her breath. She pressed on, voice rising, brimming with force. You just said truth will be distorted without control. I ask again, whose truth? Truth handed down by whom? A justice, a government, or truth forged by millions debating, verifying, erring, and correcting together? That's the democracy our forefathers bled for. The counterstrike hit its mark. Sotomayor pursed her lips tightly, but a flicker of unease crossed her eyes. For the first time, the woman on the high bench blinked rapidly, as if holding back pressure. Leavitt stared straight ahead, unblinking, like a smith hammering red-hot iron, refusing to let it cool. The room now felt like an arena. Gone was the absolute deference, replaced by tense excitement, as if the audience were watching a high-stakes boxing match where each blow could be a knockout. Sotomayor, for the first time, was openly on the defensive, and Leavitt, initially underestimated, now stood tall, eyes blazing, voice radiating authority. In that moment, all understood, this wasn't just a debate, it was a battle for the definition of democracy, and Sotomayor's initial smirk, once a weapon, had become vivid proof that she'd lost control before an opponent she'd deemed insignificant. The marble chamber still burned with intensity after the fiery exchange, but Leavitt showed no sign of cooling down. She took a deep breath, then abruptly turned to the side door, signaling a technician. The door swung open, and a middle-aged man in a gray suit entered, holding a laptop and a thick file. Reporters stirred, cameras flashing wildly, as no one expected another witness at this climactic moment. Leavitt introduced him, voice clear and commanding. This is Dr. Alan Spencer, an independent data analyst, former Stanford lecturer, and current director of a nonprofit research institute, tracking the impact of algorithms in cyberspace. He's here to present the results of a 2-year study. Spencer nodded, opened his laptop, and within moments, the large screen behind lit up with crisp charts. Red and green lines ran parallel, but the red dipped while the green soared. Leavitt explained, voice firm. This is aggregated data from millions of censored posts. The algorithms show a clear trend. 80% of restricted content came from conservative voices, while only 20% from progressives. Not random, not a glitch. This is systemic bias. The room erupted in murmurs, some reporters nearly rising from their seats to snap photos of the charts. Sotomayor furrowed her brow, eyes flashing with irritation, leaning toward the microphone, her voice sharp. Statistics can be manipulated. I don't need an expert to know data can be cherry-picked for political agendas. These charts may impress the room, but they prove nothing under legal standards. Her voice was louder than usual, resonating like a gavel, but it betrayed her loss of calm, a stark contrast to her earlier composure. Leavitt didn't blink. She nodded slightly, as if expecting the response. She signaled her assistant, and a new file was placed on the podium. She pulled out pages, held them high, and continued in an icy tone. You call this manipulated data? Then look at this. This is an independent report from Harvard University, one of America's most prestigious research institutions, conducted by scholars unaffiliated with me or any party. And the results match exactly. The screen lit up again, this time with the Ivy League's logo, followed by a research summary in bold. 80% of restricted content leans conservative, 20% leans progressive. This bias is systemic and cannot be explained by chance. The room exploded. Camera flashes blinded the eye. Some reporters shouted, trying to live report the unexpected turn. Leavitt lowered the paper, her voice ice cold, but resonant. This isn't just my report, or Dr. Spencer's. It's verified by one of the world's top universities. The data isn't manipulated, Justice Sotomayor. The truth is that conservative voices are being systematically stifled, with government involvement. And you, who wrote that the government cannot choose which voices exist, sit here today, laughing at that truth. Sotomayor leaned back, her hand gripping the pen until her knuckles whitened. She started to speak, but the cold stares of her colleagues and the relentless typing from the press row stopped her. In that moment, the double evidence from an independent expert and an Ivy League institution blocked her escape. Two sources painted an undeniable picture. In the thick air, Leavitt sealed it, voice ringing like a bell. Truth can't be distorted by a smirk. It lives in data, in evidence, in the silenced voices of the people. And today that truth has been laid before you, not once, but twice. What will you do with it? The room fell silent, only the pounding heartbeats of onlookers audible. Sotomayor didn't respond, and her silence, to the public, weighed heavier than any defense. The courtroom remained tilted toward Karoline Leavitt after the double evidence blow. The numbers, charts, and two independent sources hung on the screen like an unassailable indictment. Sotomayor sat on the high bench, hands clasped tightly, eyes lowered as if calculating. A brief silence stretched, then she looked up, her voice eerily calm, unlike her earlier unease. "Miss Leavitt, I respect your preparation, but if you want to talk legal precedent, I can cite one too." She paused, then read slowly, emphasizing each word. In Fisher v. Union State, 2008, led by a conservative court, the ruling affirmed that the government may restrict expressions likely to cause serious harm to social stability, even if those expressions are political. A wave of murmurs rose. Some reporters looked up, exchanging surprised glances. But for the first time in the hearing, Sotomayor counterattacked with a conservative precedent, using what Leavitt might have leaned on to corner her. She continued, a glint of confidence in her eyes. If a conservative court recognized that social security can override free speech in specific contexts, then explain how your stance today differs from denying what your own side once upheld. Tension blanketed the room, as if Sotomayor had flipped the board. Cameras zoomed in on Leavitt, awaiting her reaction. The room held its breath, but instead of faltering, Leavitt's lips curled slightly, her eyes gleaming with icy resolve, and she smiled, not arrogantly, but like a hunter whose prey had walked into a trap. Slowly, her words rang clear. "Justice Sotomayor, you cited correctly, but you omitted the critical closing line." The room buzzed, like a gust sweeping through the seats. Sotomayor froze, her eyes flickering. Leavitt didn't miss a beat, signaling the technician. The screen blazed again, displaying the full Fisher v. Union State ruling. Dense text appeared, then zoomed in on the final lines. Sotomayor had forgotten. However, any such restriction must face strict scrutiny and must not be used as a pretext to selectively suppress opposing political views, as that would violate the spirit of the First Amendment. The room erupted. Gasps rang out, some reporters exclaiming, "She just turned it around." Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing Sotomayor's face, which briefly paled. Leavitt turned, her voice resonant, sharp yet calm. "You're right, ma'am. That court acknowledged restrictions in extreme cases, but you conveniently skipped the most critical part, the part protecting balance, where the ruling clearly states that restrictions must never become tools for political suppression, and that's exactly what's happening today. The government is targeting opposing voices, and you, by smirking and defending it, are opposing not just the First Amendment, but the very precedent you cited." The words landed like a final hammer blow. The room shook, some in the back, gasping audibly. Sotomayor sat rigid, trying to maintain dignity, but her hands gripped white-knuckled. Her colleagues on the bench exchanged glances, wordless but telling, as Leavitt's counterstrike hit the mark. Leavitt took another step, voice lowering, but cutting through the air. "Well, this isn't the first time you've cherry-picked truth to suit your argument, but in this room, with every eye and camera, you can't hide the words you didn't want read. The public will see. History will record, and truth can't be obscured just because a justice picks and chooses her words." A heavy silence stretched. Sotomayor raised a hand to her lips, as if to speak, but Leavitt's gaze and the screen's glaring text, showing what she omitted, choked her defense. The control she briefly reclaimed vanished in seconds, leaving not a majestic justice but someone caught in deceit. Sotomayor's seemingly clever move, using a conservative precedent to attack, had become a double-edged sword, and Leavitt, with a cold smile and the simple act of displaying the full text, turned it into proof of dishonesty. The room no longer doubted. The debate had transcended argument, becoming a public unmasking where truth was revealed by the very words her opponent tried to hide. In that stifling air, Leavitt stepped back, her smile fading, and said softly but resoundingly, "Truth doesn't need to be edited to shine, only lies need the dark." The room fell silent. And in that silence, one thing was clear. Sotomayor had lost her edge, not because her opponent's argument was novel, but because her own selective wording was exposed before the world. The marble chamber still reeled from the unmasking that turned Sotomayor from aggressor to exposed. Camera lights swept back and forth, capturing every detail of the two women's faces. Leavitt, after letting the silence linger a few beats to let the weight of her revelation sink in, shifted her tone. No longer accusing or rapid fire, her voice dropped, cold but ringing clear to every corner. Justice Sotomayor, I'll ask a question no one in this room has dared ask you. Have you ever faced political pressure to support controlling speech? The air seemed to stop. Every eye turned to Sotomayor. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every blink, every breath. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Her eyes darted slightly, avoiding Leavitt's piercing gaze, then dropped to the files on her desk, as if seeking refuge in the lifeless pages. The room let out a soft gasp, not loud but enough to create a ripple, like wind through a cracked door, filled with shock and suspicion. This wasn't an ordinary question. It struck at the most sensitive point, a Supreme Court justice's independence, long held as untouchable. Leavitt didn't let the silence stretch too long. She leaned forward slightly, eyes sharp, hand on the podium, as if claiming her ground. Her voice struck. Your silence speaks louder than your laugh, ma'am. Earlier, you laughed at the people's constitutional rights. Now, you're silent when asked if politics is swaying justice. And the American people are watching. They hear no answer. But this silence answers for you. Some reporters scribbled furiously, keyboards clattering. The justices flanking Sotomayor maintained neutral faces, but slight twitches at their mouths and tense eyes betrayed unease. They knew this question didn't just target Sotomayor. It challenged the court's very image. Sotomayor took a breath, as if to respond, but only pursed her lips, saying nothing. Her gaze still avoided, fixed on the glossy table, reflecting her own face. That avoidance, to those present, weighed heavier than any confession. Leavitt stood tall, voice low but echoing off the walls. The people don't need a court cowed by political pressure. They need a court brave enough to uphold the Constitution. And if even here, a direct question gets only silence, that silence reveals the greatest flaw in this justice system. Another heavy silence blanketed the room, not awaiting a response, but feeling the weight of what was said. No more laughter, no more evasive arguments, just the silence of a justice cornered, and the cold resolve of a young woman unafraid to ask what the system had dodged for years. In that moment, without another word, all understood the confrontation had reached a new height, where justice wasn't just shaped by law, but by the courage to expose what no one dared touch. The room still trembled from the piercing question about political independence, as Sotomayor hadn't regained her usual calm. Leavitt, with icy eyes and a voice forged through fire, didn't miss her chance. She gently flipped to another file, thick and yellowed with age. Its cover clearly marked UA, District Court, 1994. Some reporters recognized it instantly, whispering the case's name, as it was one of the most notable from Sotomayor's early judicial career. Leavitt spoke slowly, each word heavy. Justice Sotomayor, in 1994, as a federal judge in New York, you wrote the ruling in People v. Morales, involving a controversial minority group. They spread extreme views, condemned by society, yet you defended their right to speak. You wrote, and I quote, "Free speech doesn't exist to protect what we agree on, but to protect even deeply dissenting voices. For if those small voices are silenced, democracy loses its meaning." The quote echoed through the room, and instantly, the large screen behind lit up, displaying the full text of that ruling, italicized words enlarged. Cameras flashed in unison, capturing the moment when a ruling from nearly 3 decades ago returned to bind its author. Leavitt turned to Sotomayor, her voice unwavering. "So I ask you, why were those small extreme controversial voices worth protecting in 1994, but not the millions of ordinary citizens today? Why did you defend those unpopular minorities then, but now mock the Americans who just want to voice concerns about borders, their children's schools, or national policies?" The room froze, murmurs spreading like waves. Some reporters turned to each other, eyes wide with a mix of shock and excitement. Leavitt had just unearthed a case long buried in legal memory, turning it into a direct blow. Sotomayor sat upright, but her voice, when she spoke, faltered slightly, lacking its usual confidence. The circumstances were different. That was a specific case, with a specific context. You can't simply compare the two situations. But Leavitt didn't relent. She pointed at the screen, where the 1994 text still glowed brightly, and spoke rapidly. Different circumstances, you say, but are the principles different? If free speech only exists in favorable circumstances, is it still freedom? If those shocking voices deserved protection back then, why are millions of citizens today, asking legitimate questions, treated as threats, or do principles only exist when they suit you? Her final words struck like a dagger to the core. Sotomayor opened her mouth to continue, but her voice cracked, vague, as if she herself wasn't sure of what she was saying. She repeated, "We must consider the context," but her voice faded, lacking strength. Leavitt stood there, posture rigid, eyes unwavering, like a warrior who had cornered her opponent. The unearthing of the past didn't just revisit Sotomayor's career. It exposed the contradiction between a justice who once defended the most extreme voices and one who now mocked millions of censored citizens. Her faltering voice, the weak repetition of different contexts, spoke volumes of an unease she couldn't hide. To the room, this clash transcended legal argument. It became a moral trial, where a young woman dared to wield the past to force a former champion of freedom to face herself. The whispers lingered after Leavitt's excavation of the past, but she gave the room no time to catch its breath. Like a fighter spotting a gap in her opponent's defense, she decided to deliver the final blow, the decisive strike to end the game. From the thick file before her, Leavitt pulled a pristine report, its white pages still fresh with the scent of ink. The cover clearly marked, Congressional Research Service, Special Report, 2025. She held it high, the chandelier's light glinting off the red congressional seal. Her voice rang out, icy but deliberate, each word falling like a heavy stone. This is the latest report from the Congressional Research Service, a nonpartisan agency established to serve Congress and the American people. It comprehensively analyzes over 1,000 cases of alleged misinformations over the past 3 years. She paused, then flipped to the conclusion. The large screen behind her lit up, displaying a highlighted passage. There is no substantial evidence that misinformation in cyberspace has caused direct and severe harm to national security. The cited cases fall within the realm of political opinion, protected by the First Amendment. The room buzzed like a disturbed hive. Reporters typed frantically, cameras flashed relentlessly. Some gasped audibly, CRS. It's the CRS. Everyone knew the CRS wasn't a partisan think tank or advocacy group, but a research body trusted by both sides of Congress for decision-making. Leavitt pressed on, voice resolute. Justice Sotomayor, you've repeatedly invoked safety. You've argued that to protect national security, the government has the right to control speech. But this report, not from me, not from any party, but from the very agency Congress trusts, concludes there's no evidence that misinformation poses a severe threat. No evidence. The last 4 words landed like hammer blows. The room erupted in sharp whispers, some even clapping softly before security reminded them to maintain order. On the bench, the atmosphere shifted. Some justices scribbled furiously, pens racing across paper. Justice Kagan leaned to whisper to a colleague, while Chief Justice Roberts tapped his fingers slowly on the wooden table, eyes fixed on the report. Meanwhile, Sotomayor leaned back, her shoulders slumping. Her lips trembled, whether from wanting to speak or from creeping helplessness. On the screen, the CRS report's words stood stark. No substantial evidence, too concise, too clear for anyone to twist. Leavitt seized the moment, leaning forward, her voice low but heavier than any shout. You say you protect safety, but you're protecting a shadow. You claim control is needed to prevent harm, but Congress's own report says there's no severe harm. So what are you protecting? Who are you protecting? Or are you just protecting the power of those who want to silence citizens? The question pierced Sotomayor's reasoning like a dagger. She opened her mouth, murmuring. The context needs closer examination. But her voice was weak, a stark contrast to her usual authority. The room heard the tremble, and that tremble overshadowed any defense. Leavitt didn't stop. She lowered her voice, but her gaze bored into her opponent. The people don't need evasions. They need truth, and the truth is written here, by an agency free of partisan flags. The truth is that silenced voices aren't dangerous. They're inconvenient to those in power, and you, with your smirk, your silence, your feeble defenses, have chosen to stand with that inconvenience, not the Constitution. A silence fell, every lens focused on Sotomayor's face, her eyes no longer steady. Her colleagues on the bench exchanged unreadable glances, but the shift was clear. The blow had struck not just an argument, but an unshakable image of authority. Leavitt closed the file, hands firm on the podium, head held high, her voice resounding, No substantial evidence of fraud, no excuse to trample the First Amendment, and no justice, no matter how high their seat, has the right to laugh when citizens demand their voice. Those final words echoed through the marble chamber, closing like a gavel's strike, marking a turning point. The upper hand had fully shifted to Karoline Leavitt, and all saw clearly. Sonia Sotomayor, the veteran justice, leaned back, lips trembling, with no counter strong enough to stand. The courtroom air was thick, like a storm about to break. The CRS report still glowed on the screen, its cold words, no substantial evidence, hanging like an invisible verdict. The other justices scribbled rapidly, pens tapping like war drums. Sotomayor, after being cornered repeatedly, suddenly straightened, hands slamming the wooden table, and for the first time in her long career, she lost her restraint. Her voice thundered through the room, sharp as a whip. If freedom is unleashed, chaos will devour justice. The sound startled some, a few reporters nearly dropping their pens, no longer the measured tone of a Supreme Court justice. It was a harsh shout, laced with anger, fear, and desperation. The words revealed her deepest fear, that unbound freedom would destroy the foundation she was tasked to protect. But Leavitt didn't retreat or hesitate. Instead, like a fighter long awaiting this moment, she stepped forward, hands firm on the podium, eyes blazing. Her voice not loud but colder than any shout. No, chaos doesn't come from freedom. Chaos comes from abuse of power. Chaos begins when people like you think they can choose who speaks and who stays silent. Her words sliced through the room like a razor, cutting across not just Sotomayor's credibility, but the system seated on the high bench. The murmurs stopped. Reporters looked up, eyes wide. A breathless moment engulfed the room, as if all had just seen a towering statue cleaved in two. Sotomayor wavered. She tried to retort, but Leavitt's voice cut through, relentless as thunder. You say freedom must be controlled to keep justice safe, but what justice fears freedom? True justice stands firm, amid all voices, even the inconvenient ones. Justice that fears freedom isn't justice. It's a mask for authoritarian power. On the bench, Justice Roberts stopped tapping his pen, staring at Sotomayor. Kagan's brows furrowed. Some younger justices set down their pens, no longer writing, watching Leavitt, as if recognizing the truth laid bare. Sotomayor gripped her pen, her voice hoarse and heavy. You don't understand. You're just starting out. You haven't seen how cruel the world can be. A single wrong word can plunge communities into hatred, make blood spill. My duty is to prevent that. She lifted her chin, trying to reclaim authority, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Leavitt gave a cold smile, not mocking but almost pitying. Ma'am, a justice's duty isn't to stop people from saying what might be wrong, but to ensure that even if they're wrong, they can speak. Otherwise, that right isn't the people's, it's the court's. And then, justice isn't a shield, it's a sword of suppression. Her words echoed off the stone walls, resounding like history's voice. The room sat stunned. Reporters forgot their keyboards. Cameras panned slowly, capturing every detail, from Sotomayor's trembling hand to Leavitt's blazing eyes in the light. The atmosphere was now a Roman arena. On one side, a legal titan trembling. On the other, a young woman charging into the heart of power. In this moment, the room knew. The balance had tipped. Leavitt stepped forward slowly, her voice low, each word heavy as stone. Justice doesn't fear chaos. Justice fears only deceit, and it's deceit, control disguised as safety, that's pushing society into chaos. You can't laugh. You can't stay silent. You can't shout to hide it, because truth, though stifled, will still ring out. Sotomayor looked down, her eyes wavering, no longer meeting Leavitt's. The pen in her hand fell to the table, a dry clack echoing. To the room, that sound was heavier than any retort. The silence was suffocating. No one stirred, no whispers, just two contrasting figures. Sotomayor bowed in her heavy black robe, and Leavitt standing tall, eyes bright, voice resolute, as if she held the scales of justice now, and all understood. The climax had arrived. The battle was no longer a series of arguments. It was a life or death clash between two concepts, freedom and control. With those words, Karoline Leavitt had struck at the system's credibility, leaving a crack too deep to mend. The pen that fell from Sotomayor's hand still rolled lightly on the wooden table, its dry clack echoing in the already hushed room. All eyes were on her, waiting for a rebuttal, a word to reclaim the authority she'd lost in her outburst. But nothing came. Sotomayor bowed her head, silver hair falling forward, partially hiding her face, lips tightly pursed, utterly silent. No more shouts, no more defenses, just an empty void, as if she'd conceded defeat from the chair deemed unconquerable. Leavitt stood there, not rushing to exploit the silence with another blow. Instead, she lowered her voice, letting it resonate in the vast marble chamber. Her tone wasn't loud, but clear and firm. I'm not here to win an argument. I'm here to defend the people's voice. The words fell, quiet yet weighty, like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Everyone felt their gravity, not in their force, but in their sincerity. Some reporters stopped typing, looking up, eyes gleaming with awe. The other justices remained silent. Some set down their pens. Others watched Leavitt, as if weighing the latent power in her statement. The silence stretched, unbroken. It wasn't awkward but haunting, a silence that forced everyone to confront themselves. In it, Sotomayor's initial smirk echoed back. Now the sound of arrogance brought low. Leavitt held her stance, hand lightly on the podium, eyes sweeping the room before returning to Sotomayor. She didn't need to say more. The message was clear. She wasn't seeking personal victory, but carrying the voices of millions silenced. In the back rows, soft breaths sounded, some nodding as if swayed not just by logic, but by the spirit. Leavitt brought, it was the spirit of someone standing firm in a storm of power, daring to face the mightiest and speak the truth no one else would. Sotomayor kept her head bowed, her fingers clasped, knuckles white, but no words came. In the context of a nation watching, that silence became a heavier verdict than any formal ruling. It was an unconscious admission she had no defense left. Leavitt's words lingered, not just within the courtroom's walls, but in the minds of all who witnessed. I'm here to defend the people's voice. A simple statement that turned the clash into more than a debate. It became a declaration, transforming a young spokesperson into a symbol of resolve against power. In that moment, the room needed no applause or cheers. The silence was the strongest acknowledgement, proof of who truly held the upper hand. And in that silence, not just Sotomayor, but the entire system on the high bench was forced to face itself. The storm had passed, and after the tempest, only a heavy, haunting silence remained, where a young woman stood firm and a symbol of power bowed her head. The post-storm silence stretched endlessly. On the ceiling, light from crystal chandeliers reflected onto the dark wooden table, casting a faint glow on Sonia Sotomayor's lowered face. She sat there, hands tightly clasped, knuckles pale from gripping, face flushed, breathing faster than usual. She knew dozens of lenses were trained on her, capturing every blink, every pursed lip, waiting for a response. But none came. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt knew it was time to drive in the final blade, not to humiliate, but to assert a principle no one could deny. She lifted her head high, stepped back from the podium to avoid an echo, then took a deliberate step forward, as if setting the rhythm for the room to hold its breath. Her voice rang out, not loud, but clear, each word resounding off the stone walls. Free speech isn't a privilege granted by this court. It's an inalienable right, and you have no right to laugh at it. The words landed heavily, so much so that a few sharp breaths could be heard from the audience. Some reporters nearly stopped breathing, their hands frozen over keyboards. Cameras zoomed in on Leavitt's face, her eyes unblinking, locked on Sotomayor. The statement wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a declaration, an indictment, a cold reminder that the high bench couldn't obscure the Constitution's clearest truth. Sotomayor sat motionless, her cheeks flushed red, her eyes darted sideways to avoid the spear-like gaze piercing her. Not a word escaped her lips, and that avoidance made the room feel it clearly. The powerful woman on the high bench had completely lost control. For the first time in her career, she became the one questioned before the public, while the young woman below, once dismissed, now held the scales. Leavitt continued, her voice lower, but each word like a driven nail. The American people don't come here to beg for permission to speak. They don't need a court to allow them to express their thoughts or concerns for their country. They were born with that right, protected by the First Amendment, a right no one can trample. And this court, with all its power, exists only to protect that right, not to ration, slice, or turn it into a political tool. The room fell silent. On the bench, some justices stopped writing. looking up at Leavitt with eyes mixing awe and quiet acknowledgement. Others stayed silent, lips pursed, eyes narrowed. They knew her words targeted not just Sotomayor, but the entire system they were part of. Leavitt didn't waver. She pointed to the Constitution carved on the wall behind, her voice ringing like a bell. You sit on that high chair, draped in a black robe, and you think that gives you the right to define truth, to pick which voices are heard. But no, ma'am, truth doesn't lie in a justice's hands, nor in a government's. Truth is found in debate, in dissent, in the chaos of freedom. And if you forget that, if you laugh at that, you're not just laughing at me, you're laughing at this entire democracy. A few soft gasps rose from the audience. Reporters exchanged glances, as if sensing they were witnessing a moment that would be long remembered. Cameras panned quickly, capturing Sotomayor's face, eyes downcast, lips trembling slightly, flushed not with anger, but with the shame of being exposed before the public. Leavitt stepped back slightly, took a deep breath, and lowered her voice, now not with icy sharpness, but with a sincerity that silenced the room. I'm not here to humiliate a person. I'm here to remind you that the court's power, the power of anyone in this room, is dwarfed by the power of the people. And if you forget that today, let these words serve as a reminder. Every justice, every senator, every president, all must bow before the Constitution. In that moment, the heavy silence in the courtroom was no longer tense, but a silence of truth acknowledged. No one dared interrupt. Not a cough, not a rustle of paper. Only a thick atmosphere remained, where each person felt they'd witnessed a declaration that could echo into history. Sotomayor stayed seated, face flushed, eyes averted, hands trembling as they gripped the pen like an anchor. But she didn't speak. She couldn't. And that silence, to the room, confirmed everything. Leavitt closed with a steady, resolute gaze. She didn't need to shout or add another word. Her final declaration was etched into the air. Free speech isn't a privilege. It's an inalienable right. And no justice, not even Sonia Sotomayor, has the right to laugh at it. The room remained hushed, heavy, but no longer the silence of a typical courtroom. It was the silence of a society hearing truth spoken plainly, a silence that would echo long after the lights dimmed and the courtroom doors closed. Karoline Leavitt's footsteps rang decisively on the marble floor, each step like a beat in the final symphony of the battle just ended. She didn't turn back, didn't need to, knowing that behind her, the marble chamber was steeped in an unprecedented, heavy silence. Sonia Sotomayor's initial smirk, her shout, her fragmented defenses, all had vanished, replaced by a haunting stillness that stretched from the justices' bench to the press gallery. The justices on high, once immovable symbols of authority, now seemed like cracked statues. Chief Justice Roberts no longer tapped his pen, his hand resting limply on the table, fingers stiff. Justice Kagan crossed her arms, eyes distant, as if grappling with something undeniable. Some younger justices, silent throughout the clash, leaned forward, watching Leavitt's figure, their eyes betraying a mix of admiration and unease. On the clerk's desk, the pen still lay where it had fallen, its sharp clack from minutes ago echoing in everyone's memory. From the press gallery, the once frantic typing had quieted. Reporters, who lived to capture every detail for breaking news, were caught in the moment. Some stopped, staring at the podium where Leavitt had stood, as if afraid typing would shatter this precious silence. Cameras still flashed, but slower, no longer rushed, as if deliberately preserving each expression, each glance, each detail shaping a historic moment. Sonia Sotomayor remained motionless, her black robe draped over her, concealing most of her body, leaving only her tightly clasped hands visible, knuckles white. Her face was flushed, eyes fixed on the glossy table, unable to meet the room. Her lips trembled, parting as if to speak, then closing. Every camera zoomed in, capturing each second of silence, each heavy blink, and that silence, not any words, became the verdict. Leavitt kept walking, her small figure in the emerald green suit, stark against the vast space, like a bright arrow piercing a thick darkness. Once a little-known name, a young spokesperson underestimated by many, today each step from the podium declared she had done what thousands of politicians, scholars, and lawyers dreamed of, but dared not, forced a Supreme Court justice to bow in silence. No applause broke out. No one shouted her name, but that absence carried a terrifying weight. The silence was no longer deference to the court, but an acknowledgement of truth. Power had shifted. The one with absolute authority on the high bench had been silenced by a youthful voice below, and that voice didn't represent an individual, but millions whose voices had been stifled. Leavitt paused near the heavy mahogany door at the room's end. She didn't look back, but in that moment, the entire hearing flashed through her mind. Sotomayor's opening smirk, the leaked emails bolded with priority, suppressed political misinformation on the screen. The 2015 ruling turned back to bind its author. The 80% 20% statistics displayed clearly. The question no one dared ask, leaving the room breathless. The 1994 case forcing Sotomayor to face herself. The CRS report dismantling all claims of safety. And finally, Sotomayor's shout crumbling before a cold reply. Chaos doesn't come from freedom, but from abuse of power. All culminated in a declaration. Free speech isn't a privilege granted by this court. It's an inalienable right, and you have no right to laugh at it. The door swung open, light from the hallway flooding in, casting a long beam across the marble floor, splitting the room. Leavitt's silhouette stepped into the light, then faded as the door closed. But inside, the echo lingered. Sotomayor kept her head bowed. The other justices remained silent. Not a word spoken. The clerk bent to retrieve the pen but trembled, dropping it again. The clack resounded in the quiet room, like a bell tolling for the shift that had occurred. Reporters resumed typing, slower now, more deliberate, as if not just writing news but a page of history. One whispered, "This is the day the order changed." Another nodded. A smirk started it, and silence ended it. The courtroom air felt like the calm after a fierce storm. Everything stood still, but all knew the landscape had changed. Cracks had appeared in the once unshakable wall of power, and through those cracks, the light of truth had slipped in, unstoppable. This story would be debated, dissected, and spun in the media, but for those present, they knew they'd witnessed a moment no words could dim. They saw a Supreme Court justice driven to bow in silence. They saw a young woman stand tall, resolute, unyielding, and they saw power shift, not by force or threats, but by truth. As the room emptied, footsteps echoing, no laughter or chatter followed. The silence clung to each person, for they all knew they couldn't forget the closing words etched into the air. A laugh may start the show, but truth writes history. And that silence, not cheers, not applause, was the clearest proof that history had just been written here, in the heavy marble chamber, where a laugh began and a truth concluded. The confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Sonia Sotomayor wasn't just a heated courtroom debate, but a symbol reflecting the tense relationship between free speech and political power in today's America. The detail of Sotomayor's opening smirk sparked a chain reaction from leaked emails, bolded with priority, suppressed political misinformation, to the CRS report stating no substantial evidence of significant misinformation. Each piece of evidence Leavitt presented shattered the national security justification used to defend speech control. Notably, Leavitt's revival of Sotomayor's 2015 and 1994 rulings, and her display of the full Fisher v. Union State text to expose selective quoting, turned the justice from accuser to accused. The climax came when Leavitt declared, "Chaos doesn't come from freedom, but from abuse of power," culminating in "free speech isn't a privilege granted by the court," silencing the room. Small details, the clerk's fallen pen, the audience's caught breath, Sotomayor's flushed face, painted a vivid shift in power. The lesson for Americans: never underestimate your voice, for freedom exists only when protected and practiced daily. For leaders, the message is clear. Power isn't for defining truth or stifling dissent, but for upholding the Constitution and public trust. A laugh may signal contempt, but only truth can write America's history. Thank you for joining us to witness Truth Unveiled, where the people's voice echoes louder than power on the high bench. Please subscribe to our channel to catch the next historic moments, where we continue to confront power and demand justice.